This is your coffee break. Hi, friends. I am back with you this week, and I have a really cool guest for you. I have a really cool guest for you every week, but this week is a long-time Right Now podcast listener. I think maybe even one of my first listeners. His name is Andrew Coons. He is a screenwriter living in, I believe, Minneapolis. And you know what? I don't want to have any spoilers here. So Andrew, take it away. Tell us a little bit about yourself, or a lot, whatever you prefer.
Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me on the podcast. I have been listening for quite a while. I think I jumped in somewhere before 10 episodes, but not right at the beginning. So somewhere in the early days. So I liked it before it was cool.
Oh, so you're a Right Now hipster. I like it.
Exactly. So I do live in Minneapolis. I moved up here in August 2014, lived in the Carolinas for a while, some other places before that. I went to film school in the Carolinas and went to film school because I always wanted to be a writer. That was always my thing as I was growing up. I'm going to write. And then as you start to look at career path options, you start to realize that, I don't want to be a journalist, and poetry doesn't pay, and novels take a long time. So, what else can I do? And I just kind of got into filmmaking because there was this opportunity to take what I was writing and then bring it to life on the screen. And there's also a lot of different job opportunities in filmmaking. You can go into directing and camera work and all this stuff. So when I moved up to Minneapolis, I actually moved up to take the position with a film production company here. And right now, my current job is creative director. So I'm handling a lot of the client relations. I'm managing the edits, doing some of the shoots. But the great part about it is that it also includes writing a lot of the scripts for our clients. So a lot of my work day to day that involves writing is probably more on the technical side. It's, hey, we've got a 90-second script, which is going to be roughly one page, and it has to fit these bullet points and, all these buzzwords and stuff, I'm sure you're very attuned to with your job, just a little bit. Right. So, but the cool thing about it is that it does give me the opportunity, because a lot of times clients will come and just say, here's what we want to say. Here's our website. Here's kind of what we want the video to do. We don't know how to write a script, go to it. And so then I get to fill in the visuals and kind of walk them through the process and write these things. On the side, I have written in the past more in the creative field with screenwriting. I've done a couple different short films that have, premiered at different film festivals and whatnot. I did some psychological horror type stuff and some other drama type things. And we actually are currently in the film festival circuit for one that my company did, but it was a film about the tragic epidemic of child sex trafficking in the US. And so that was cool because it's part documentary, part narrative. And so I got to write the narrative portion and then direct the documentary portion and kind of try to make those merge. The cool thing about screenwriting and why I do feel like it's a legitimate form of writing is that even though you're writing kind of the bullet points a lot of times, in exception to the dialogue, which is usually word for word, but you're just writing the bullet points, you have to write in such a way that it's easily looked at and easily imagined just from writing the script or reading the script. But then that it's also succinct enough that if I were to hand that to someone else, they can take it and run with it. So it's kind of like writing a novel and a how-to manual at the same time, which is kind of challenging in its own way, but lots and lots of fun.
So you immediately raised something that I've never even thought of before, and that is the thought that screenwriting is not a legit form of writing. Where does that come from? I've never heard that before.
I don't know that I've necessarily even heard that anywhere, because I think people would recognize screenwriters as writers. I think maybe more on the corporate side of things, it wouldn't be considered a legitimate form of writing. I'm a corporate screenwriter. Well, it might get lumped into the same thing as I write how-to guides, or I write, a manual for a chainsaw. It is still writing, and it takes quite a level of proficiency. But people wouldn't necessarily look at it as creative, but I found it to be very different.
I think a lot of us probably write for our day jobs. And I'd like to hear a little bit about how you balance that tension between, you go and you do all this creative work, you pour your heart and soul into work for corporate clients. How do you balance that? How do you balance your own need to create for yourself? Tell me a little bit more about that.
I don't know that I always balance it fairly well.
Well, who does?
And there are a lot of situations where, a client will take on the script writing and then hand me something. And I love all our clients, but they'll hand me something that's, not written the way it needs to be written. And so then there's a little bit of polishing that needs to be done. I think a lot of times for me, it's not trying to turn every single writing gig at my work into my creative outlet. There are certain jobs that come along that I'm like, this is a meaty one. This is good. There's a lot to this. There's opportunity for creative outlets. Let's really sink into that. And some days it's literally just, I have this many pages to write and I'm just going to get them done and I'm going to do the best I can, obviously, but it's not going to be something that satisfies my creative urges, which is why I then go home and do other writing. So
yeah. What keeps you focused during the day? And maybe this is a little bit of a selfish question because I ask myself this sometimes too. How do you keep going through the day knowing that you have like 8 hours of writing to do and it's not writing that you want to do? What keeps you going?
Well, I mean, first to clarify, I don't usually ever write for 8 hours straight at work. It's not terribly because I'm managing kind of a department. I'm doing a lot of different things. So I'm going on film shoots. I'm managing edits. I'm doing graphics. And so the writing portion is a chunk of that, Gotcha. That because it's a chunk, I get to kind of schedule it in at my opportune times. When I have the most creativity, when I want to do it, basically, and then get away, go to a coffee shop with my laptop or something and kind of focus on that. Not to say that deadlines don't come up and sometimes it's just, putting your nose to the grindstone and trying to get it done. But yeah, it's not an 8-hour drudgery of writing for me just because there's so many different things I'm managing.
Tell me a little bit about the tenets of screenwriting.
One of the big things for screenwriting is that you're writing for a time. You're writing to fit 90 seconds, 3 minutes, 30 seconds, something like that. And so as I'm writing, there's some tricks that you can do, like roughly a page or a page and a half of script is equal to X amount of time. But then there's a lot of sitting there and reading it out loud and then revising it and then reading it again and giving myself 10-second pauses for where I know graphics are going to go. And that's where a little imagination goes a long way, but it also challenges me to put on paper something that when the client reads it or when another filmmaker reads it, it's going to read at the right pace and in the right way it should. The other thing is like so you would normally think of a script, like if you ever watched a movie and someone handed someone a script and it's this kind of column type thing where it's description and then dialogue, description, then dialogue. That's how I write my narrative scripts, but corporate scripts are usually written in 2 columns. So it's video on one side, anything that's visual, and audio on the other. So it breaks everything apart. It makes it feel very artificial when you're first writing. But there's also kind of a clarity that comes with that because you can side by side put what a character is doing and saying. You don't have to waste time vertically on the page to get there, which is exactly what video is. You're watching and listening to something at the same moment.
I love that. And I love that there's like a spatial planning process for that too. I had not known about that. That's awesome.
Yeah, you could almost write a script in an Excel sheet if you wanted to. That's a little too clinical for me, but that's essentially how it works. It's very very mathematical, very linear. And so then finding the ways to be creative within that becomes the fun part.
So I'm really curious about your career. And then after this, I'll stop talking about your career and we can talk more about the kind of writing that you like to do on the side. But I noticed something when you first introduced yourself and talked about how you got into screenwriting. It almost sounded like there was a process of elimination that you follow. It's like, okay, no, I don't want to be a journalist. No, I don't want to do this. I mean, do you think a lot of writers follow that process of elimination style?
That's a great question. And I know that for myself, I followed that because I had a very pragmatic, practical view of what I wanted to do with my life. I'm the oldest born in my family, conservative background. Things were pretty structured, knew where I was going to go to college for a long time, kind of had an idea of what I wanted my life to be like based on what other people I had seen. And so for me, it made a lot of sense to make a list and start checking and crossing things off. I think maybe other writers, they might go through that, but I think that maybe a lot of writers do something that I haven't done till recently, and that's they follow that calling to write through challenges. And not that I'm going to say I copped out, but there was a little bit of, okay, I don't know how hard it's going to be to make it as a novelist or a poet, but this filmmaking thing it looks like it's got a lot of opportunities and I can still write. And I love film. I watched the Lord of the Rings behind the scenes features, all 25 hours of them. And it was just like, oh my gosh, I have to do that. So for me, it's almost like lately I've come back to taking some more of those chances, exploring different forms of writing, not thinking so much about, where can I get the most steady paying job, or where can I, get my degree in, because now I have my degree, I have a job that I really love. And so I can kind of open myself up towards pursuing things that I kind of left on the wayside when I left high school.
Tell me about some of those things. I know that you've been blogging, you've been writing poetry, short fiction. Tell me about, first of all, what sparked you to re-explore those mediums, and then sort of how that process has been going for you.
Well, this is going to sound like a paid advertisement, but you sparked that desire to bring back a lot of this into my life. And there was something in me that said, I really want to start writing again, but I don't know where to start. And I started Googling podcasts, all sorts of stuff, found yours, found a couple others, started reading some different websites, and, your whole thing of you are a writer. That was big for me. And that helped me actually understand a little bit that, hey, even though I'm doing corporate screenwriting, I am a writer, and that I can take that badge and apply it to the creative outlets. When I was young, the desire to write came from where it usually comes from, which is the love of reading. Mm-hmm. And we had a library literally 200 feet from our house. And so every day we'd walk over, get new books, bring them back. I burned through the Hardy Boys series and, all the mysteries and the J.R.R. Tolkien stuff, C.S. Lewis, everything. And that's kind of what sparked this love of literature and of storytelling. Got into my teenage years, got a little angsty, wrote a lot of really bad songs, was in a really horrible band for a very short amount of time. And, the cool thing about songwriting is that it is a form of poetry. And so, when I picked writing back up here in the last year or so, creative writing, I thought at first, well, my experience is kind of writing songs, even though they weren't that great. But then I kind of segued that into kind of delving a little bit more into poetry and just a real love for that.
That's awesome. And thank you. My gosh. I promise I am not paying Andrew to say these lovely things about my show, but boy, that hits me that, wow, okay. Sometimes it's so nice to see the reason that you're doing this fulfilled. So my gosh, thank you for saying that.
Well, thank you for doing the podcast.
So talking about, being that creative introvert, you do blogging, you do short stories, you do poetry. The poetry came from the songwriting, but where did the blogging and the short stories, were those just sort of continued experimentations, or?
I think they are still continued experimentation. I'm not nearly as regular with them as I am with other stuff. I think in the last 8 months, I've written 1 short story, 5 blog posts, lots of poetry, though. Lots of stuff on my Instagram and then my website, and then a lot of stuff that hasn't seen the light of day yet. So I think it's more just I don't want to limit myself to one thing. And I think that's, again, not the mistake I made, but the path I chose when I decided to be a screenwriter and said, okay, all my writing is going to be screenwriting. And now I'm at a point where that's awesome. And I love screenwriting, and I, have learned a lot about it, but I have the desire to try more things. And so when I decided to start writing poetry again, I was like, okay, but don't limit yourself to just being a poet. If I have the idea for a short story, go for it. I'm actually, I hesitate to say this, but I actually am working on a novel. I'm through the prologue in the first chapter right now, and I've had to take a break because that's the longest I've ever written into one novel idea. So, that's something I'm just going to pick at. I'm not putting any restrictions or expectations on myself to say I have to write this novel in, the month of November or whatever it is.
Yeah.
Just going to pick at it. And in the meantime, what comes out of me the most is the poetry.
Tell me more about that. So you're more drawn to the poetry because it's more emotional. I don't want to lead you with an answer here, but tell me more about that connection.
Well, and I think there is a bit of a connection between poetry and screenwriting, because with screenwriting, you're trying to maximize your time. You're trying to get things across in a very visual, visceral way. And I kind of view poetry the same way. It's, usually it's shorter format, page maybe, and you're trying to say as much in that page as some people might say in a novel. And so a script, even if it's feature length, might be 90 pages. That's not a novel. That's a short story. And so short story and poetry have kind of been what I've always gravitated to because I have a lot of different ideas. They kind of come at me a mile a minute sometimes, and it's easier to just knock one out, knock a couple stanzas out, move on to the next idea. That's why writing a novel has always been intimidating and is a tough challenge for me right now because it's the continuation of one idea for, 50,000 words or so. And so that's a tough thing for me because I tend to be all over the board.
My next question was going to be, what's the most difficult of these for you? And it sounds like your novel. Tell me more about your novel. Like, what made you decide to start that? And are you planning it? Are you pantsing it? It sounds like you're going to just tackle a little bit at a time. But yeah, tell me about your novel.
And
Very
I know
excited.
the term pantsing from your podcast a few weeks ago where you talked about being a pantser. It's a little bit of both. I don't know how to write a novel, so I'm kind of making it up as I go. I have a rough outline. I have a very clear idea of the themes, of what the climax might be, and of the general idea. I'm kind of trying to approach it the way I would approach a script. So, a 3-act type thing with, getting off the bat quickly and, interesting characters and stuff, but then just kind of pausing in moments and filling the page with some good description or something, the type of reading I like to do. I'm not going for anything as thick as a J.R.R. Tolkien book, but one of the beauties of that style of writing is that we can sit and talk about the way sunlight came through a tree for 2 pages. And if you do it right, it's beautiful and it's worth your time. And so, again, I'm not comparing myself to Tolkien or anything, but it's nice to be able to, in the midst of the story, when there's a detail I want to talk about, just kind of pause and spend some time with it. And so that's kind of how I'm approaching it, just kind of like a script with more fleshed out descriptions.
I like that. I'm always a fan of genre mashups, maybe. Mm-hmm. And I kind of like that idea of using what works and what doesn't work in different genres to inspire what you're working on. Is it a fantasy novel, since you keep talking about Tolkien?
It is kind of a modern day fantasy, but it's not centered around teenagers or love stories. It's thumbs up from Sarah on the screen. It's actually incredibly personal. It deals with some stuff from my past and kind of puts it in a fictionalized aspect because you write what you know. And mm-hmm. I don't think I'd write a very good 13-year-old girl romance love triangle type thing. So I write what I know, and it's kind of what I'm going after. So it's going to be fantasy, but it's going to be grounded.
Are you an urban fantasy fan at all?
So many of those books are so bad. It's so hard. I love the genre, and it's so hard to get through some of the books sometimes. But I find the bad novels as inspiring, if not more so than the good ones sometimes, because there's that sense of, okay, I think I could write better. And so then why don't I? It's kind of that thing of, I have this theory that the only thing that's stopping me from having written a novel at this point is the fact that I have not written a novel. It's not that it has to be good. It's not that it even has to be published. It's not that it has to win a prize. It has to be done. And that's my goal, is to finish one and then see where it takes me. And it may never see the light of day, but at least then I can say, yep, wrote a novel, can do it.
Okay, so I have a theory, and my theory is that we're the same person. Okay? So stick with me on this. I don't know, I've just related with so much of what you've talked about. I didn't do the screenwriting per se, but everything that you've said, and this might sound weird, I've just felt this like kinship with everything you said, the love of reading, I'm
glad you said it first, because it sounds super creepy if I were to come on and be like, I've been listening to your podcast every week, and I think we're the same person.
Okay, good. I'm glad that it's not just me. But so, okay, this is even creepier. So like while I talk to people, I'm going to show you. I keep this little list of notes, and it helps me to just remember things I want to go back to and talk about. And there's this one creepy one at the top that just says same person. So I'm just going to check that off because that's
all right.
All right, creepiness accomplished. So you talked about not wanting to limit yourself to just one type of writing. And I think that a lot of writers are afraid to write outside of what they know or what they're comfortable writing. Can we talk a little bit about here? Okay, this is going to sound even creepier. Can we talk a little about your fears? Like, what holds you back sometimes when you sit down to write?
I think the fear of sucking is a big one. And that's something I've gotten a lot better at lately because I've started to embrace more this idea that done is the goal for me right now. So I'm 27. I've got a wife and a child. I have another baby on the way, which I can't say what it was, but we just found out the gender today. So it's been a really good day.
Yay! Congrats. Everybody take a second. We're gonna, yay. That was me clapping. Okay, Go on.
I've graduated, and I'm saying all this to get to a point, not to build myself up. I've got a 4-year degree. I've owned my own business. I now work as the head of a department for a small production company. I have been published, even though a long, long time ago. I'm the type of person that when I set my mind to a goal, I get really obsessed about it until I accomplish it. And that does leave you with a little bit of this kind of void because as soon as you accomplish one goal, there's 50 more to stare you in the face. But there's this idea that if I'm going to write, it has to be goal oriented. It has to be for the purpose of being good, getting published, winning an award, all these things. And that has been my mindset for a very long time. It was very important to me for a while that my films make it into film festivals, that they win awards at film festivals, that I get the raise, that I get the recognition, all these things. And what I've come to realize recently, maybe in the last few weeks even, is that there will never be an end to lofty goals. And that's okay. It's good to have them. It's good to chase them. But what I'm trying to do more lately is embrace the process, embrace the love of the doing of it. And this is where like actually taking an hour or two every week and going to, the Starbucks and a Barnes and Noble and sitting by myself with some headphones and writing, I don't know. It's given me a sense of centeredness and a sense of like, it's kind of like putting yourself in the environment you want to be in. Like we all see the cliche shot of the writer furiously scribbling away with his coffee and everything. And it's a little cliche and it's a little hipster and everything. But by putting myself in that situation, I've started to embrace like, that's a lot of fun and it feels really good. And sometimes what I write is absolute crap. And sometimes there are nuggets of it that I like, but I always walk away having really kind of refreshed myself by that experience. And so kind of to try to put a bow on that whole thing for your question, it's, the fear in the past has always been, what am I writing for? What is the goal? And can I be good enough? And by kind of letting that go and writing for the sake of writing, then I find that, whatever pops in my head, I'll run with it, whether it's a novel idea, a poem. I still write scripts for fun, short stories, haiku, whatever it is. Sometimes it's just journaling. That just becomes a lot more rewarding.
Man, I just identified so much with everything you just said. And it's so easy to cheat ourselves out of that rich experience. And I identify especially with what you said about setting goals. And I tend to be, I don't know if this is one of my negative personality traits. I'm very ambitious and I like to know that I'm doing things well. And what validates me is, like you said, winning awards and getting praise and all this stuff. But it's never enough. Mm-hmm. It's never enough. And you say, okay, I've surpassed the goal of getting X number of followers on Twitter, for example. Now let's shoot for X squared or...
The Instagram thing has been incredibly rebuking for me because I got onto Instagram and I kind of assumed I'll start posting my writing to Instagram. I'll hashtag all the right things. And before you know it, I'll have hundreds of readers. I have like 30 followers on Instagram and I still keep posting because I enjoy it. And it's gotten me back to that thing of like, I can't tell how many people have actually read the poem, but if I get 5 likes, you know what? That's 5 people that have read my work who never would have read my work before. And if they liked it, it means they liked it. It touched them in some way, unless they're spamming. But, you can usually tell the difference. And so it's kind of gotten me back to that purity of, because I think we all sit and we all say, my gosh, if I could just touch one person with my writing, if I could just change one person's life or influence one person, then that would be enough for me. That would give me purpose. We say that as a lofty goal, but then we're not happy when that happens. And so it's kind of gotten me back to that mentality and appreciating the fact that, no, I'm not getting thousands of hits on my website or whatnot. But in the same way that as I scroll Instagram and I find one thing that, kind of touches me and makes me think, it's a cool feeling to know that I did that for someone else, even if it was just that one person.
What helped you make that transition? Was it just sort of a mental throwing your hands up in the air and saying, like, I literally cannot meet these ever growing goals? Like, what brought you to that point? Because I want to get to that point too.
Sure. Well, to be very candid here, and I've mentioned this to you before in emails, I deal with depression and with anxiety. And about 8 to 12 months ago, I kind of hit a low point and decided to check myself into counseling. And it's taken a very long time for me to kind of wrestle with some things, but it's even just been in the last couple of months that I feel like a lot of that counseling and therapy has really paid off. And I've started to embody some of the things that I've been taught there and kind of work through. And so I think part of that is just, what do you put your self-worth in? I think that self-worth is a really tough topic for me because for so long, I either looked at it and said, well, self-worth is crap, I don't know. It's kind of in my background, and this is not a bash against my background, people who taught me, but it's kind of in my background to just say, others first, what you do doesn't, matter so much as long as you do a good job or you do the right thing or whatnot. Sacrifice yourself for the good of others. There's a lot of nobility to that. There's a lot of truth to that. But in doing that, you end up putting your self-worth in how much you self-sacrifice.
Oh my gosh.
And so then you just become this really depressed person because you're constantly cutting yourself down at the knees, not cutting yourself enough slack, and putting your self-worth in those achievements and in the big landmarks. And, life has a few big landmarks. And it's different for everybody, but you get married, you have a kid, you graduate from college, you get that big job, et cetera, et cetera. You retire, maybe you get published or something. But those things, there might be a dozen of those in your life. Your life's a lot bigger than a dozen moments. And so putting your self-worth in the everyday moments, in the process, in the enjoying sitting there in a coffee shop writing for the sake of it, in the enjoyment of wrestling with my son in the living room. I think there's a lot more potency in putting your self-worth there than it is in putting your self-worth in, all these big accomplishments. And those things are great. Those are icing on the cake. This film I was talking about before, the sex trafficking film, it just won some awards. We didn't expect it to. It was, a phenomenal, feeling, but now it's over. Those film festivals are done. The trophies are in the mail, but they're not going to do anything for me in the future. They're just hunks of metal and plastic. But the thought that we actually reached some people with that film about a very, very hard subject, that maybe one child might be saved out of that life because someone saw it and did something about it, that's an ongoing thing that gives me a lot more gratification than any festival award could.
Boy, thank you, Andrew. Thank you so much for your willingness to be candid about a really difficult subject. And I want to thank you especially because that's something I think that I needed to hear today about self-worth. So thank you for being willing to open up and talk about that.
Sometimes you say the things that you need to hear yourself as well. I think that this is all stuff that if you had talked to me a month ago, I wouldn't have been able to verbalize it like that. Yeah, it's an ongoing process. It's an ongoing process. We don't ever become perfect, but we try to become better. And that's another thing I've kind of realized recently is that because there's perfectionism wrapped up in there as well. And, if I'm just trying to be better than I was yesterday, if I'm just trying to be a better father, husband, writer, creative director at my job than I was yesterday, even if it's a very small step, you made progress. You didn't take a step backwards. And that's a good feeling too.
I love what you say when you talk about self-sacrifice. And I love not tying your self-worth up in that. Like, that's just, thank you again for saying that. I'm still kind of mulling this over. I'll probably cut this part out, but
it's okay.
Seriously, thank you.
And there's a lot of value in self-sacrifice. I mean, as a husband or a wife, you sacrifice for your spouse. As a friend, you sacrifice for your friends. You sacrifice for your children. This isn't anything against self-sacrifice, but there's a difference between that and then martyrdom and just, beating yourself into the ground and never giving yourself the self-care and the things that you need in order to go on and to be fulfilled. And I think that it's super important to remember that before your friends, before your family, before your career, you were still you. And that you will be you after all of those things. And that it's in the same way that they talk about, once you have kids, you need to work hard on your marriage because the kids will be out of the house eventually. And you don't want to be living with someone who you've grown apart from. Well, to a degree, you have to keep working on yourself because there might come the day that you are alone. And there, not to get too morbid here, but there will come the day that you die, and we all die alone. And so you need to be able to look at yourself in the mirror and be okay with who you are, separate from all the other people that come in and out of your life, even your most closely loved ones. And that's something that's really hard to do because we're brought up to think that that's a selfish thing. It can get there. It can easily be selfish if you're not careful with it. But you can go too far to the other extreme of the pendulum, and that can be just as dangerous.
Yeah. Do you have, so for any listeners who might really also be identifying with that, do you have any suggestions or advice for where they can start placing themselves in a good, healthy spot on that spectrum?
Well, as it relates to writing and to all things writing, my advice would be to write about everything. To not think that you can only write about good times when you're having them, or that, as I did for a long time, you can only write about the bad times. Write about all of it. Write about every little thing. And yeah, I mean, some of it's going to be junk. Some of it's going to be garbage. Some of it's going to come out very, very awkwardly. But you might be surprised what some of the good stuff is and what some of the stuff is that when you read it back to yourself, it starts to speak to you. You know, writing can be therapy. And there are times, and I don't know if anybody else would enjoy these writings, but there are times when I read things and I go, man, that feels like exactly what I needed to hear. I think when you start writing about everything, you stop writing with an end goal in mind, and you write more about your experience and your thoughts and your passions. And so if you're a novelist, you know, try writing a little poetry. If you're a poet, try working on a short story. If you're a corporate writer, you know, try something creative. If you're creative, maybe try something that's a little more corporate-y. Maybe take a gig or something. I don't know. I feel like it's really good to switch it up.
You're making me want to drive to a Barnes and Noble and sit down and surround myself with books and take some time for myself. I love that you're treating writing as more of an exploration than something that you need to accomplish or something you need to use to validate yourself. With that in mind, are you going to do anything with your novel when you finish it? Are you going to try to publish it, self-publish?
I think it would be impossible not to. You know, I'm actually also simultaneously getting close to self-publishing a collection of poetry. So I don't think it's a bad thing to have those goals. And I don't think that that's something that I'll ever get away from. But it's what's going on in the meantime, you know, that's important to have perspective on, because it can be a long time in between, you know, goal number 1 and goal number 2 if they're the big lofty goals. Mm-hmm. So you have to enjoy the process as well. Otherwise, you're going to get burnt out, I think.
I think you're 100% right. You've just given me so much wonderful, fresh perspective today. And so if people are interested in maybe reading some of your poetry on that Instagram account that we talked about, do you have a website that can direct people to all of your different social media outlets? Yeah,
it's just andrewcoons.com. There's not a ton on there, but then that can take you to @AndrewCoonsWriting, which is my Instagram handle. You know, a lot of things that I put on my Instagram are 2 minutes away from being written. I don't do revisions or anything. I just throw stuff up. There's spelling errors sometimes and all sorts of things, but it's nice to have a place to throw things up and feel like they're permanent and they're out there, and then you can revise them later. There is a little instant gratification involved in that, and maybe that's something I need to get away from, but it's also, I don't know, it's fun to connect with other writers on Instagram and stuff, and not just, you know, be in my own little coffee shop, never sharing anything with anyone. So
yeah, I mean, and it's almost like publishing it a little bit, you know.
It is, and it's actually tricky because as I've looked into getting published in other magazines and stuff, like they'll consider that having already been published. Mm-hmm. And then there's also the thing of like, okay, if I'm going to release a book, how much do I want to have already put on my Instagram? So that's the thing where like you'll maybe put a stanza or a line on Instagram, which they tend to get the most likes anyway, a quippy little line of something that's romantic or, you know, whatever.
Yeah. People love sound bites.
They love sound bites. And it's frustrating sometimes because you'll put a sound bite up, get tons of likes, and you'll put like something meaty and like a full poem. You're like, I really worked on this, and no traffic. And that's been another great lesson for me, is just to go, you know what, stop putting your worth into how many likes you got, because you know that this is better than the sound bite. And people are they're just skimming by because it's too long. if you understand the system, then you understand that, it's not a judgment on you. It's just that it's not what Instagram is. It's the Twitter of poetry. Mm-hmm. So
it's the medium and the message, right? It's maybe not the right forum for long form poetry, but those sound bites, those will get good engagement. Mm-hmm. So Andrew, thank you so much for reaching out to me, for kind of putting yourself out there.
Yeah, same here. Thank you so much, Sarah.
And I'll make sure that we have links to andrewcoons.com in the show notes for today's episode. I'll also link to his Instagram so you can follow him there, and maybe Twitter and maybe some other things. It depends what you're comfortable with.
Thank you very much. This has been wonderful.
Thank you, Andrew.